The modern-day narrative of the dispute over Sabah, aka North Borneo, often revolves on the question of whether this vast territory abundant in natural resources belongs to the Philippines or Malaysia. But both the Philippines and Malaysia are modern-day nation-states, and unknown to many, the dispute over Sabah predates the establishments of either the First Philippine Republic in 1899 or the Federation of Malaysia in 1963. In fact, one other modern-day nation-state had once also actively claimed dominion over North Borneo, and this is none other than the Sultanate of Brunei. As mentioned in part 1, while the British were acquiring control over what is now Sabah, another conflict was brewing behind the scenes. The British were not entirely sure who this vast northern region of Borneo even belonged to in the 1800s, because by the 1800s and especially during the 1700s, the Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Brunei were in a somewhat tug-of-war about who truly held sovereignty over North Borneo. So, how exactly does Brunei fit into this already convoluted conflict involving Malaysia, the Philippines, and the Sultanate of Sulu? Mabuhay o in Kapampangan, luwid kayo! Welcome back to another history video. It is me, Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. And in this channel, I make videos about our people's history, culture, and everything in between. So if you like learning about the Philippines and Southeast Asia, don't forget to like, share this video, comment down below, and please subscribe. And in today's video, we will be digging deeper into the pre-colonial historical roots of the dispute over Sabah. But before we begin, here are some few reminders. I understand that today's topic is complicated and quite controversial, but I do hope that this series of videos about Sabah will help many of you to dig deeper and understand the conflict better. So I'll be including a list of credible sources and recommended readings for those who are genuinely interested to learn more. Let me also just clarify that today's video does not necessarily reflect my own stand regarding the matter, but rather as a historian and a direct descendant of both the Sultans of Brunei and the Sultans of Sulu, this is my way of providing my viewers with a better understanding of the history behind the dispute over Sabah. And if there's something that I missed, or something or anything that you would like to add, let us know in the comments below. Let us share what we know and learn from one another instead of fighting each other in the comments. I mean, the point of this video is to deepen our understanding of the issue and not to arouse further divisions. So, how exactly does Brunei fit into this already convoluted conflict involving Malaysia, the Philippines, and the Sultanate of Sulu? Long before the arrival of the Europeans, the people of what would eventually become the Sultanate of Brunei and the Sultanate of Sulu had always had an intertwined history. Indeed, the native and indigenous people of what are now North Borneo and the Sulu archipelago have always had a shared history, interconnected societies, kindred cultures, and interwoven roots. Unfortunately, we won't have enough time today to discuss the earlier histories of Borneo and Sulu. Instead, we'll be focusing more on the events that directly resulted in the present-day conflict over Sabah. So during the 1300s and the 1400s, Southeast Asia was experiencing a period of Islamic expansion, with various sultanates emerging across the region. And today, we'll be focusing on two of these powerful sultanates. With its capital on the western coast of Borneo, the Sultanate of Brunei was established by Sultan Muhammad Shah in the 1360s by breaking free from the Majapahit Empire. It eventually conquered much of the island of Borneo, particularly the regions along the coast, including what is now Sabah. In fact, Borneo and Brunei are practically the same name, the same word, just spelled differently during the early contact with the Europeans. And in the nearby Sulu archipelago, the Sultanate of Sulu would emerge by uniting the different kingdoms and ethnic groups of the surrounding islands. It was founded in the 1400s by a known descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, the revered Muslim scholar and explorer Sultan Sharif ul Hashim. And over the centuries, Sulu would expand to include territories in what are now the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And as mentioned in part 1, the union between Sultan Bolkiah of Brunei and Putri Leila Menchanai of Sulu in the late 1400s resulted in a complicated but consolidated political unity between the royal houses of Brunei and Sulu. Some historians would argue that Sulu was once a vassal state to Brunei. However, the feudal term vassal is Eurocentric, and it does not truly reflect the fluid geopolitics of Southeast Asia during this time. Kingdoms like Manila and the Sultanate of Sulu were not necessarily vassals of Brunei. Instead, they were within the Sultanate of Brunei's mandala or sphere of influence, mostly because the royal families of Sulu, Brunei, and Luzon were related to one another. Nevertheless, these intermarriages resulted in the closer blood ties between the many royal houses of insular Southeast Asia. In fact, at one point, the Rajas of Manila, the Lacans of Luzon, the Sultans of Sulu, of Maguindanao, Sarawak, Pahang, and many more were all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Sultan Bolkiah and Putri Leila Menchanai. This was indeed a golden age for the Sultanate of Brunei. But this, however, was also when European aggressions in the region had begun. By 1572, the Kingdom of Luzon, a collection of indigenous polities, Muslim principalities, petty kingdoms, and city-states like Manila, centered around Tondo and what is now Manila Bay, had fallen to the Spaniards. In 1578, Spain would also attempt to conquer the Sultanate of Brunei. But despite falsely claiming and boasting that they had conquered all of Borneo in their letters to the King of Spain, the conquistadors quickly realized their mistake in underestimating what was then the most powerful sultanate in Southeast Asia. Spain tried to renegotiate peace with Brunei in 1579, but Sultan Saiful Rizal refused. It was only in 1599 that Spain and Brunei signed a peace treaty that also resulted in the resumption of trade between Luzon and Borneo. But unknown to many, between the late 1500s and throughout the 1600s, there were many attempts and conspiracies between the Sultanates of Brunei, Sulu, and the Kapampangans to liberate Luzon from the Spaniards. And you can learn more about this in my older videos and in my book, Tondo, Slavery, and the Revolt of the Lacans. So if you want to help me make more videos like this to support my channel and my research, please be my patron on Patreon or be a member of my YouTube channel or get copies of any of my books, coloring books, and ebooks, or any of the merch link down below. Maraming salamat po! Okay, so if Brunei was so powerful, then why did Sulu end up claiming Sabah? As mentioned, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Southeast Asia from the late 1400s to the early 1600s was the Sultanate of Brunei. Unfortunately, in a similar sequence of events that catapulted the plot of Game of Thrones, murder and vengeance would plunge the mighty Sultanate into a bloody civil war, splitting the royal house right down the middle. In 1662, Brunei's Bendahara or Prime Minister Abdul Mubin assassinated Sultan Muhammad Ali along with his family and followers. This was done in revenge for the murder of Abdul Mubin's son at the hands of the son of Sultan Muhammad Ali during a heated cockfight between the young cousins. It is worth noting that both Sultan Muhammad Ali and Bendahara Abdul Mubin were the grandsons of Sultan Saiful Rizal, who was once victorious against the Spaniards. Immediately after the assassination of Sultan Muhammad Ali, Abdul Mubin proclaimed himself as the new Sultan of Brunei. However, he lacked the crucial support of the people. In order to secure his throne and reunite the different factions of the royal court, Abdul Mubin appointed Pengiran Bongsu as his Bendahara, a rank that is second only to the Sultan. But this attempt at reuniting the royal family backfired. Pengiran Bongsu was the son of the late Sultan Abdul Jalilul Akbar, and he was also the son-in-law of the slain Sultan Muhammad Ali. And by this time, he also had the overwhelming support of many influential groups in the Sultanate, because the people of Brunei despised Abdul Mubin for the murder of Sultan Muhammad Ali and the massacre of the royal family, while at the same time, they adored Pengiran Bongsu. In fact, for many in the Sultanate, Pengiran Bongsu was the rightful successor and therefore should be crowned Sultan, instead of the usurper Abdul Mubin. And for those who may not know, the title Pengiran in Brunei is only granted to those who are related by blood to the royal family, particularly particularly those who are direct descendants of a sultan. In many Western cultures, this would be the equivalent of a prince of the blood, or in French, prince du sang. The term bongsu, on the other hand, means the youngest child, a cognate of bunso in Kapampangan or bunso in Tagalog. But anyway, after realizing the fragility of his position, the self-proclaimed Sultan Abdul Mubin had to flee to Pulau Cermin, a fortified island at the mouth of the Brunei River, which he established as his new capital. On the other hand, Pangeran Bongsu was crowned by the people of Brunei as Sultan Muhyiddin, the rightful Sultan of Brunei. However, despite this initial victory and Abdul Mubin's weakening position, both factions would continue to fight a long and bloody civil war. And in the midst of this conflict, both Sultan Muhyiddin and Abdul Mubin requested support from Sulu. And as an incentive, Sultan Muhyiddin offered territories if the Sultanate of Sulu helped him defeat his opponent. And although the Sultan of Sulu initially took a diplomatic attitude by meeting with both the rival camps, Sultan Salahuddin Bakhtiar of Sulu subsequently sent warriors to support Sultan Muhyiddin, resulting in his victory and the death of Abdul Mubin in Pulau Cermin. Consequently, as a reward after the conflict ended, the territory of North Borneo was transferred from the Sultan of Brunei to the Sultan of Sulu in 1675 or in 1704 according to other historians. But is it true that Sulu never really fought in the Civil War? That they just came later to watch the battle from afar and then loot the villages after? The participation of Sulu in the Brunei Civil War has been controversial. On one hand, in earlier accounts as recorded by the British officer Hugh Lowe, the Sulu warriors took an active role in the battle and tipped the balance in favor of the victorious Sultan Muhyiddin. But on the other hand, in later accounts, it was said that they were limited to being spectators of the conflict while the warriors of Brunei carried out all the work, even going as far as claiming that Sulu only landed after the victory to loot. But this was historically baseless. Be that as it may, the intervention of Sulu in this conflict was a historical fact, and the transfer of the territory was made without opposition, considering the good relationship between both royal families, backed by marriages and centuries of blood ties. In fact, unknown to many, apart from the Sultanate of Sulu, there was also significant support from Sultan Kudarat of Maguindanao. Sultan Kudarat was not just the brother-in-law of Sultan Salahuddin Bakhtiar of Sulu. Sultan Kudarat's mother was also the granddaughter of Sultan Bolkiah and Putri Lela Menchanai, and therefore he too was a cousin to the Sultans of Brunei and the Sultans of Sulu. But the motivation behind Sulu and Maguindanao's intervention during the Brunei Civil War was not really about territorial expansion nor about any pretensions over the throne of Brunei. And although territorial concessions were undeniably attractive, the true reason behind their help in ending the bloody civil war in Borneo was to secure peace and to protect the region's booming international trade. Culturally and religiously speaking, as prescribed in Islamic jurisprudence, the Sultans of Sulu and Maguindanao were honor-bound to make such decisions on the basis of the greater public interest. Abdul Mubin's presence in Pulau Cermin severely interrupted the flow of commerce between the islands of what are now the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, including the much coveted spice trade. The usurper Abdul Mubin was determined to block international trade and to weaken his rival by choking Brunei's economy. This bloody civil war also coincided and perhaps directly resulted in a famine across the lands belonging to Brunei. It was said that it was this famine that urged Sultan Muhyiddin to desperately seek the support of Sulu. And according to Muslim historians such as Cesar Majul, it was precisely their desire to end the famine and to unblock the flow of much-needed international trade that truly persuaded the Sultans of Sulu and Maguindanao to get involved in Brunei's civil war. And on top of this, the Sultanates in Maluku, aka the Spice Islands, such as the Sultan of Ternate, were also concerned. They were afraid and worried that the bloodbath in Brunei would spill over eastwards into the Moluccas. And so the Sultanate of Ternate implored their ally Sultan Kudarat of Maguindanao to join Sulu in helping Brunei. Countless Tausug, Sama Bajau, Maguindanaoan, and Iranun warriors from Sulu and Mindanao sailed to Brunei, and they indeed tipped the balance and ended the bloody civil war. So what exactly happened after? How come many are saying that the Sultan of Brunei never really gave Sabah to the Sultan of Sulu? Let's find out. As a consequence to the civil war, Brunei's power became even more vulnerable. It began a long period of decline between the 1700s and up to the early 1900s until the discovery of oil. Sulu, on the other hand, was enjoying the peak of their maritime power, becoming one of the most important players in Southeast Asian geopolitics for centuries. And since the late 1600s and the early 1700s, the Sultanate of Sulu, along with the Sultanates in Mindanao, were busy fighting off the Spaniards in Sulu, Mindanao, and the Visayas, because there was no doubt that Spain had long wanted to subjugate Sulu and Mindanao. So while Sulu was preoccupied with the imminent threat from the Spaniards at their doorsteps, beginning in the 1710s, the Sultanate of Sulu also became busy keeping their vast territories together. For example, the indigenous Tudong people on the northeastern coast of Borneo also revolted against Sulu. Sabah, on the other hand, was sparsely populated, and perhaps Sulu felt more secure in their North Borneo territories that they decided to pour their resources elsewhere. So while Sulu concentrated on the Spanish threat from the north and the small rebellions to the south, Sabah to the west of Sulu fell into a period of relative neglect. In the early 1700s, it allegedly became infested with criminals. It was also claimed that the violence in Sabah became so widespread that it threatened the security of the neighboring Sultanate of Brunei. And so, from Brunei's perspective, the lands of North Borneo under Sulu became increasingly uncontrollable. And perhaps they felt disappointed that their Sulu cousins failed to look after and take good care of the vast territories Brunei had once given to Sulu. And thus, they started refusing to recognize Sulu's sovereignty over Sabah and began to reclaim their former territories in North Borneo by questioning Sulu's participation in ending the Brunei Civil War in the 1600s. But this should also be taken with a grain of salt. According to the British, such as Alexander Dalrymple, they noted that by 1768, Brunei was embroiled in another civil war for several years. And this further weakened Brunei and drained the Sultanate's treasury and resources. Nevertheless, it would seem that Brunei would take advantage of Sulu's war with Spain in order to divert their people's attention from the local issues, such as the worsening economy. They instead focused their eyes on regaining the Sultanate's former glory by way of reclaiming their former territories in North Borneo. As a result, skirmishes between the forces of Sulu and Brunei would be fought over Sabah in the 1700s, including a Sulu invasion of Brunei in 1771. In which Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin I sought the help from the British to intervene, because during this time Sulu was also an ally of the British against the Spaniards, so it was in the British interest to keep the peace between their Southeast Asian allies. So who exactly had sovereignty over North Borneo? Was it Sulu? Was it Brunei? Or what about Sabah's indigenous people? As mentioned earlier, during this time, Sabah was sparsely populated. In fact, most of its population was concentrated along the coast, populated by the Sama Bajau people, and a small number of villages spread wide apart from one another in the interior, populated by other ethnic groups such as the Kadazan Dusun people. Today, the indigenous Kadazan Dusun people make up the largest ethnic group in Sabah, followed by the indigenous Sama Bajau. But if we travel back in time, during the pre-colonial era, the indigenous Sama Bajau people were the predominant population in North Borneo, especially along the coast and much of the known settlements. It is also worth noting that by this time, there were large settlements of Iranun people throughout the northeastern coast of Borneo. Now, historically speaking, regardless of which sultanate they belonged to, the indigenous Sama Bajau people were pretty much given the freedom to govern themselves. themselves. Indeed, throughout the centuries, the Sultanate of Brunei relied on the Sama forces for the governance and the security of North Borneo. And this political setup would also continue under the Sultanate of Sulu. In other words, the Sama clans of North Borneo had de facto, aka effective control of what is now Sabah for centuries. And when Brunei attempted to reclaim Sabah in the 1700s, the indigenous Sama clans of North Borneo would repledge their allegiance to the Sultanate of Sulu. Historically, by the 1760s, the Sultanate of Sulu had without a doubt assumed both de facto and de jure sovereignty over large chunks of what is now Sabah, particularly 4 out of the 5 present-day administrative divisions of Sabah, including popular places like Kota Kinabalu, Kota Marudu, Sandakan, Lahadatu, Tawau, and many more. And in the 1800s, this was also supported and reaffirmed by the numerous treaties between Sulu and many European powers, like the British, the Spanish, the French, the Germans, and the Dutch. These were treaties of peace, commerce, and friendship in which they officially recognized that Sulu indeed had de jure sovereignty and de facto jurisdiction over the region we now call Sabah. In fact, in the immediate aftermath of the Brunei Civil War in the late 1600s and the early 1700s, no one really questioned the transfer of Sabah from the Sultan of Brunei to the Sultan of Sulu. Despite the lack of a formal cession treaty, at least none that we know of, no one really questioned Sulu's sovereignty over Sabah. The Sultans of Sulu historically became the undisputed sovereigns of North Borneo since 1675. Sulu's sovereignty was strengthened by the support of the local population, such as the indigenous Iranun and Sama people. It was only almost a century later, in the late 1700s and again in the 1800s, that the Sultanate of Brunei began to challenge and question Sulu's sovereignty over these lands. Nevertheless, historically speaking, Sulu was for the most part in effective control of the region. So from the Western perspective, Sulu's sovereignty over North Borneo was confirmed by the different treaties with the European powers. While on the other hand, from the indigenous perspectives, this recognition of sovereignty was affirmed and strengthened by the allegiances of the indigenous population and the local rulers of Sabah to the Sultan of Sulu. Now, the history of North Borneo and the dispute over Sabah does not end here. In fact, as we shall see in the next part of this series, the events of the 1800s and the 1900s, along with the involvement of Western imperialist powers like the British, the Spanish, the Germans, and the Americans, would further complicate the conflict. So I had originally planned on including the colonial era in today's video, but obviously we're running out of time. So in part 3 of this series, we will start with the colonial acquisition of North Borneo in the late 1800s, aka the treaties that led to the modern-day dispute over Sabah, including the post-World War II diplomatic tug-of-war between Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia over Borneo. And then we'll also explore the modern-day social, geopolitical, and humanitarian impacts of this issue, particularly the millions of marginalized and exploited people on both sides of the border, caught in the middle of the seemingly never-ending conflict. So stay tuned as we learn more and deepen our understanding. And that is it for me today, so let me know what you think about today's topic in the comments below. And if you like this video or learned a thing or two, don't forget to like, share this video, comment down below, and please subscribe. Help me reach my goal of reaching over 100,000 subscribers by the end of this year. But of course, before we go, today's shoutout goes to Jauhal Zizi from Sabah, Benjamin from Sulu, Aziz Mukadi from Indonesia, Hermawati from Canada. And of course, special thanks and special thank you to my patron on Patreon, Darkside Bear from Sarawak, Malaysia. This video and this channel will not be possible without the love and the support of all my patrons and subscribers throughout these years. Anyapin dakalpong salamat kay Kongan, or in Bahasa Sug, magsukol tuod kay mu, and in Bahasa Melayu, terima kasih. See you next time, my Tagalog kita kits, and in Kapampangan, Miki Tix, and in Bahasa Sug, balik kisab, and in Bahasa Melayu, jumpa lagi!